The morning sun rose over the mist-laden hills of medieval Europe, bathing small villagers in a pale, golden light. Smoke spiraled from the chimneys of humble cottages, the scent of burning wood mingling with the earthy aroma of tilled fields. Life in these villages moved slowly, measured by the rhythm of the seasons, the crowing of roosters, and the relentless toll of the church bell. Peasants rose before dawn, their hands calloused from work, their feet hardened by the uneven cobblestones and dirt paths they walked daily. Their world was simple yet harsh, a delicate balance between survival and the unknown forces they believed lurked just beyond their sight. The towns were small, clustered around stone keeps or castles that loomed over them like silent sentinels. These fortresses were not only the homes of lords and knights, but also symbols of power and protection. Beneath their shadow, peasants tilled the land, tended the livestock, and sold their wares at local markets. Though their lives were governed by the practicalities of work and sustenance, imagination filled the spaces in between. Stories were as vital as food. Tales of dragons that devoured cattle, of witches who could curse entire families, and of spirits wandering the forests after sunset were whispered from one hearth to another. Children listened wide-eyed, their minds teetering between belief and doubt. For in this world, the line between reality and legend was blurred. Food was scarce for most. The diet was simple: coarse bread, pottage, thick with vegetables, and occasionally meat or cheese. Wheat fields rye, and barley stretched across the countryside, the bounty of each season eagerly anticipated. But harvests were unpredictable, subject to rain, pests, or disease. Famine loomed ever close, and when crops failed, tales of curses or supernatural punishments often filled the void left by reason. It was not only the fear of hunger that shaped life. The shadow of disease and plague haunted every household. Doctors were rare, their remedies rooted in herbal lore and sometimes superstition, a blend of science and ritual that may seem strange today, but was vital for survival then. Clothing, too, reflected both necessity and social order. Peasants wore woolen tunics, simple cloaks, and sturdy boots. Wealthier townsfolk might boast embroidered fabrics, furs, and shoes dyed in vivid colors, signaling their status. Even in appearance, myths and imagination were present. A stranger in a dark cloak might be whispered about as a sorcerer, or an unusual animal sighting could spark tales of demons or mythical beasts. Every shadow held a story. Every strange sound demanded explanation. Fear and curiosity intertwined, shaping a society in which superstition was not folly, but survival. The forests surrounding the villages were alive with their own dangers and mysteries. Wolves prowled at night, their eyes gleaming through the underbrush. Deer and boars were hunted for food, but rumors often transformed these animals into more fearsome creatures. Travelers spoke of massive black hounds with glowing eyes, fairies dancing at twilight, and the occasional ghostly figure gliding silently between the trees. These tales were not just entertainment. They were warnings, lessons, and sometimes the only way to make sense of an often unpredictable world. Every myth contained a grain of truth. The sharp teeth of a wolf, the rustle of a nocturnal animal, the shimmer of moonlight on misty fields all became fodder for legend. Yet, amidst the hardships and fears, community thrived. The village square was the heart of social life. Fairs, festivals, and church gatherings brought people together. Stories were told and retold, evolving with each telling, mixing history with imagination. It was here that the seeds of medieval myths took root, blending real events like the sudden appearance of a strange animal or an outbreak of illness with human fears and hopes. Over time, these tales grew taller than the mountains themselves, crossing generations and creating a world where dragons, witches, and enchanted forests were not just possible, but real in the minds of those who lived through the foggy, candlelit nights. Even the clergy, guardians of both faith and knowledge, played a role in shaping these beliefs. Priests and monks chronicled events, often blending moral lessons with factual accounts. Miracles were recorded alongside mundane happenings, further blurring the line between what was seen and what was imagined. The villagers relied on these narratives to interpret the world. Every disease, every strange birth, every sudden death could be explained as a sign from heaven or a warning from the dark forces that walked unseen among them. Knowledge and myth were inseparable, each reinforcing the other, creating a landscape in which fear and wonder existed side by side. As night filled the village, settled into quiet. The sounds of labor replaced by the soft lull of crickets and the occasional howl from distant forests. Candles flickered in windows, casting long shadows that danced along the stone streets. Children huddled close to their parents, listening to the wind through the trees, hearing the faint creak of the castle gates, and imagining what might lurk beyond the firelight. The stories they heard before sleep were not just tales, they were lesson, guides, and glimpses into a world where reality and legend were forever entwined. In these quiet moments, the medieval mind thrived, building a rich tapestry of myths that were terrifying, captivating, and sometimes shockingly real. In the shadow of the dense European forests, stories of terrifying beasts roamed as freely as the animals themselves. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of dragons that scorched entire fields with their breath, of ogres that roamed the hills, and of monstrous wolves that were taller than any man. These creatures were more than myth. They were warnings woven into the fabric of daily life, reminders of the dangers that lurked beyond the well-trodden paths of village life. But beneath the fearsome tales lay seeds of reality, hints of creatures that could have inspired the legends. Dragons, for instance, were never real in the fire-breathing sense, but their shadow lingered in the bones of the earth. Fossils of giant reptiles and unusual animal bones unearthed from the hills and riverbeds became evidence of these fearsome beings. Two villagers, with little scientific understanding. A fossilized jaw or a massive claw was proof enough of a beast that had once terrorized their ancestors. Dragons were not merely fire spitters in story. They symbolized the unknown, the uncontrollable forces of nature that humans had no power over. Forest fires, lightning strikes, and sudden storms were explained as the wrath of these mythical creatures, and parents warned their children to respect the wilderness, lest they awaken a sleeping dragon. Ogres and giants were another class of nightmare. People told stories of massive, humanoid creatures that lurked in dark forests, preying on the unwary. In truth, these legends often had very real origins. Occasionally human remains, or skeletons of unusually large stature, were discovered, and without context or explanation, villagers' imaginations ran wild. Even ordinary wolves, bears, and other predators, when seen in poor light or from a distance, could be exaggerated into monsters that dwarfed men in size and ferocity. The forest itself, vast, shadowed, and full of echoes, played a role in creating the illusion of these monsters. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush, became a sign of something supernatural lurking just beyond sight. Sailors and travelers brought stories of creatures from distant lands, adding layers to the local myths. Accounts of enormous snakes, strange birds with wingspans wider than a man's reach, and unknown beasts washed ashore were recorded and retold, growing taller with each narration. Some of these animals were real, like the occasional bear in Central Europe, wild boars or wolves, but others were misinterpretations of unfamiliar fauna, seen in fleeting glimpses and colored by fear. People's natural instinct to explain the unexplained through narrative led to an ever-expanding pantheon of monstrous life. Yet, not all creatures were invented from ignorance or fear alone. Certain animals exhibited unusual behavior that seemed almost supernatural. For instance, owls, silent and watchful, became associated with death or omens. Bats, emerging at dusk, were linked with witches or vampires. Even commonplace animals, through the lens of superstition, acquired mythic qualities. People learned to respect and sometimes fear these animals, often with good reason. Wolves could attack livestock, wild boars could gore unwary hunters, and venomous snakes were a constant hazard. The legends were grounded in reality, and the exaggeration of size or ferocity was a natural response to survival instincts in a dangerous world. Stories of monsters also served practical purposes. They warned children away from dangerous areas, taught moral lessons, and reinforced social cohesion. A tale of a dragon destroying the harvest reminded villagers of the fragility of life and the need to respect nature as power. Legends of ogres in the forest reinforced caution during travel. The line between entertainment and education was thin, but it was effective. Myth and reality blended seamlessly, each reinforcing the other, creating a vivid mental landscape in which danger and wonder walked hand in hand. By night, the forest transformed. Moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting elongated shadows that moved with the wind. Crickets chirped, and distant hoots of owls echoed like ghostly cries. 4 villagers returning from the fields. Every sound became a potential threat, every shadow a possible beast. Their imaginations, sharpened by the stories they had grown up with, turned ordinary phenomena into epic encounters. A falling branch became the swing of a giant's club. The distant roar of a bear became the growl of a dragon. In this way, the mythic world was never far from the real one. The two coexisted, feeding and amplifying each other in a cycle of fear and fascination. Even scholars and clerics could not fully separate fact from fable. Manuscripts illustrated dragons with wings spread wide, ogres towering over peasants, and forests filled with unspeakable horrors. These illustrations were not mere art. They were attempts to understand and communicate the unknown. Villagers relied on them as guides, proof of the world's dangers and mysteries. And so, in every corner of medieval Europe, monsters existed not always as they were imagined, but always as something to respect, fear, and tell stories about. Their existence, rooted in reality, but magnified by imagination, shaped not only how people saw the world, but also how they moved through it. Cautious, watchful, and endlessly intrigued by the shadowy wilderness beyond their doorsteps. The summer of 1347 arrived with a heat that seemed unusually oppressive, and with it, whispers of a sickness that no one could understand. It began in port towns, carried on ships that had sailed from distant lands, bringing not goods or spices, but something far more terrifying: death. Villagers first heard of strange boils, blackened skin, and a fever that claimed life within days. The Black Death, as it would later be called, was like nothing Europe had ever seen. And for the people of the time, explanation could only be found in fear and superstition. As the plague spread through villages and towns, people turned familiar stories to make sense of the unimaginable. Priests preached that it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins, while others whispered that witches, demons, or cursed travelers had brought the sickness. Families blamed outsiders, strangers, and even neighbors. In somme tones, fear erupted into hysteria. Entire streets were abandoned, and corpses lay unburied, waiting for the mercy of plague-ridden hands. Masks were improvised, charms were worn, and prayers were muttered endlessly. A desperate attempt to appeal to powers unseen. The terror of the invisible enemy fueled legends of supernatural interference, and in the minds of the afflicted, myth and reality became inseparable. Yet beneath the fear and superstition lay a scientific truth that medieval minds could scarcely grasp. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia, pest carried by fleas that infested rats, which traveled on ships and through towns. Poor sanitation, overcrowding, and ignorance of disease transmission allowed it to spread with horrifying speed. The boils and blackened skin that horrified witnesses were the result of septicemic infection, a physiological reality twisted into legend. Fever, delirium, and sudden death seemed miraculous or cursed, because there was no understanding of germs, hygiene, or medicine that could explain it at the time. What people interpreted as divine wrath or demonic plague had a very real, biological cause. In the villages, life transformed under the shadow of this invisible predator. Markets emptied, fields went untended, and the fabric of daily life was disrupted. Survivors lived in constant dread, wary of any visitor or neighbor, and myth grew to fill the gaps in understanding. Stories spread that certain families were cursed, that specific towns had been marked by the devil, or that rare herbs could protect against the invisible scourge. Some villagers engaged in ritualistic practices, carrying sweet-smelling herbs to ward off disease, painting crosses on doors, or flagellating themselves in penance. These actions, however irrational from a modern perspective, were grounded in a desire to exert some control over a world that had suddenly become chaotic and incomprehensible. The social consequences were immense. Entire generations vanished, leaving fields untended and trade routes deserted, communities fragmented, and the hierarchy of feudal life faltered. Nobles and clergy were not immune, though they often fled to countryside estates, leaving the peasantry to face the disease alone. In these dire circumstances, fear became a tool for survival, and myths offered an explanation that science could not. If it were the devil or a curse, then at least there was a story, a way to conceptualize the horror, and perhaps a path, however misguided, to safety. But amid the terror, human resilience emerged. People adapted to the new reality, finding practical ways to survive. Burning homes of the infected, isolating the sick, and fleeing areas of outbreak all inadvertently helped to reduce the spread. Some individuals, guided more by observation than superstition, began to understand patterns. Certain conditions, animals, or behaviors seemed linked to infection. Slowly, fragments of empirical knowledge began to form, although they were often mingled with the persistent myths. The Black Death, devastating as it was, became a crucible in which fear, superstition, and early science were all forged together, laying the groundwork for a more informed understanding of disease in later centuries. At night, the villages were eerily silent. Smoke from chimneys mingled with the mist, creating an otherworldly landscape. Empty streets echoed with the sound of crows, scavenging for butt, and the occasional toll of a church bell for another lost soul. The living kept their distance from each other, doors were bolted, and families huddled around fires, listening to tales of divine punishment or protective charms. Every shadow became suspicious, every cough a harbinger. In this environment, myth and reality reinforced each other. The unseen bacterium and the imagined curse were one and the same in the minds of the terrified. The medieval imagination had transformed the plague into a living story, a legend of suffering that was as real in human experience as the fever and boils themselves. As dusk fell across the villages of medieval Europe, a different kind of fear crept through the cobblestone streets and shadowed cottages. Whispers of creatures who walked at night, drinking the lifeblood of the living, sent shivers down the spines of the peasantry. Vampires, they said, could rise from graves, their eyes glowing with hunger, their fangs sharp as knives, seeking the warmth of human veins. Stories of these creatures spread swiftly, carried by terrified travelers and exaggerated by imagination, embedding themselves in the collective fear of communities already familiar with the unknown. The origins of the vampire myth were rooted in both observation and misunderstanding. In times before modern medicine, sudden deaths from disease were terrifying and inexplicable. Bodies that bloated or developed dark patches after death were interpreted as evidence of the deceased returning to feed. For instance, a person who died of tuberculosis or plague would leave behind visible changes in the corpse that seemed unnatural. Villagers, unfamiliar with decomposition, interpreted these signs through the lens of superstition. A corpse with a fresh appearance, blood around the mouth, or unusually red lips became a candidate for a vampire, and fear spread like wildfire. Accounts of vampires were not merely stories of horror, they were attempts to explain the inexplicable. When livestock died mysteriously, people attributed it to the nocturnal activities of these creatures. Families would take measures to protect themselves. Garlic hung in windows, stakes prepared for the grave, holy symbols placed near doors. Priests offered prayers and blessings to ward off these nocturnal predators, blending faith with folk wisdom. The line between practical precaution and mythic belief was blurred. Every strange sound at night, every shadow moving under the moonlight, reinforced the idea that vampires were real. Interestingly, the vampire myth also intersected with cultural fears of the unknown and social tension. Outsiders, strangers, or marginalized individuals were sometimes accused of being vampires, reflecting communal anxiety and the need for an explanation in uncertain times. Stories were passed down, growing in detail and intensity, until the vampire became a symbol of death, disease, and the dark, untamed forces of nature. These tales served a dual purpose. They were cautionary, warning people of the dangers of the night, and they offered a narrative for grief, loss, and sudden tragedy. They could otherwise seem senseless, The forests and graveyards, shrouded in mist and moonlight, provided the perfect backdrop for such legends. Villagers walking home after tending fields or returning from markets would hear the rustle of leaves, the howl of distant wolves, or the cry of an owl, and their minds would fill in the gaps. What was a harmless nocturnal animal could be reimagined as a creature thirsting for blood. The imagination, sharpened by stories and personal loss, made the mythical feel entirely real. Children slept with small charms tucked under pillows, and adults kept vigil in the windows, hoping to catch sight of or avoid the nocturnal menace. Yet, beneath the myths were simple truths of biology and decay. People had no way of understanding the processes that occurred after death. How gases could cause bloating, how blood could appear to surface on lips, or how natural movement could shift a body. Diseases like rabies or porphyria may have inspired tales of sensitivity to sunlight, aggression, or unusual behavior, traits later attributed to vampires. These stories, though exaggerated, had a basis in observable reality, illustrating how fear and misunderstanding could produce legends that persisted for centuries. The vampire myth, like many medieval legends, was not merely entertainment. It was a framework for understanding the unknown. In communities where death visited often and unexpectedly, having a story, a villain, or a reason for tragedy provided a semblance of control. Villagers took comfort in rituals, in precautions, in narratives that transformed random misfortune into patterns that could be recognized and countered. And in this way, the myth of the vampire thrived, walking hand in hand with reality, an eternal shadow cast over the simple lives of those who dared to look too closely at the dark. By night, the villages grew silent. Once more, the moon cast long, shifting shadows across the narrow streets, and the forests beyond whispered in the wind. Families bolted their doors, and small candles flickered in windows, warding off the imagined horrors of the night. In these quiet moments, the line between life and legend blurred. The villagers' world, steeped in fear and imagination, had made the vampire real enough to touch, to worry about, and to tell stories of 4 generations to come. In the minds of the medieval people, myth and reality were never separate. They were intertwined, feeding on one another, and shaping the very way the world was understood. In the deep, shadowed forests of medieval Europe, villagers spoke in hushed tones of men who transformed into wolves. These were no ordinary tales for amusement. They were warnings, whispered over flickering hearths, tales of neighbors or strangers whose eyes glowed in the moonlight, whose teeth gleamed sharper than any knife, and who prowled the edges of villages seeking to tear life from the living. The werewolf, or loup-garou as the French called it, was more than legend. It was a manifestation of fear itself, a story that combined the dangers of the natural world with human imagination, creating a terrifying bridge between man and beast. The origins of the werewolf myth were complex, rooted in observation, misunderstanding, and human psychology. Wolves were real and deadly. Packs could decimate livestock and occasionally attack humans, leaving wounds that seemed unnatural and horrifying. The sight of a man covered in blood, whether from a hunting accident, disease, or mental instability, could easily be interpreted as evidence of transformation. Skin diseases, rabies, and other illnesses caused strange behavior or physical changes, and without knowledge of science or medicine, villagers attributed these anomalies to supernatural causes. What they feared was not only the beast in the forest, but the beast within humanity itself. People believed that a cursed individual, or someone who had made a pact with dark forces, could transform under the full moon, gaining the strength and savagery of a wolf. Tales of these transformations were passed from generation to generation, each retelling more elaborate than the last. Villagers developed rituals to protect themselves. Iron stakes, protective charms, and prayers were used to safeguard homes, livestock, and families. Fear dictated behavior as much as any law. Children were warned never to stray into the forest after dark, and travelers avoided certain paths, knowing the stories of men-beasts that stalked the night. Yet, beneath the myth was a thread of reality. Wolves were present in Europe in great numbers, especially in forests. Far from the watchful eyes of townsfolk, they were nocturnal hunters, silent and cunning, and their attacks on livestock or humans left wounds that could seem deliberate or even intelligent. Occasional reports of missing persons, paired with the appearance of bloodied or wounded animals, further reinforced the notion of a shape-shifting predator. In some cases, mental illness, grief, or social pressure led individuals to behave in ways that seemed inhuman, giving credence to the frightening stories. The line between human and beast blurred in both fact and imagination. Stories of werewolves also served social and moral purposes. They warned of the consequences of sin, of greed, or venturing too far into forbidden places. Villagers were taught to respect both the forest and the unseen forces that governed it. Those accused of being werewolves were often outsiders or individuals at odds with the community, a reflection of social tensions projected onto supernatural narratives. The myth became a tool for understanding behavior that was otherwise incomprehensible, a way to explain the unexplainable, and a mechanism for reinforcing communal norms in a world fraught with danger. At night, the forest transformed into a landscape of shadows and whispers. The moonlight danced through the leaves, casting elongated shapes that could easily become imagined wolves or prowling figures. Howls echoed in the distance, real or imagined, and villagers tightened their doors, keeping children and livestock close. Every rustle of wind, every snapping branch, fueled the imagination, making the legend of the werewolf tangible. It was a world in which reality fed myth, and myth fed reality, where the dangers of the natural world and the fears of the human heart merged into a single, terrifying story. In the end, the werewolf myth endured not simply because it was entertaining, but because it was functional. It warned, taught, and explained. It gave a face to the unknown, a narrative to the fearful, and a framework for navigating a world in which the night was filled with both real predators and imagined horrors. Villagers learned to coexist with their fears, crafting stories that were as much a part of survival as fire, food, and shelter. In the medieval mind, the werewolf was never just a story, it was a lesson, a caution, and, for those who dared to wander after dark, a very real presence. In the moonlit shadows, in the quiet glades and shadowed meadows of medieval Europe, villagers often spoke of beings that danced between the trees at dusk, creatures no taller than a child, glowing faintly with light and carrying a sense of otherworldly grace. These were the fairies, the nature spirits, the guardians of the forests, streams, and meadows. To the people of the time, their presence was both enchanting and fearsome, for while some tales spoke of blessings and hidden treasures, others warned of tricks, mischief, or even harm. The fairies were not merely stories, they were a lens through which humans sought to understand the natural world, especially the inexplicable. People observed the forests carefully, and in those observations, ordinary phenomena became magical. The flicker of fireflies at twilight, the reflection of sunlight on dew-laden spiderwebs, or the rustle of leaves in the wind were interpreted as signs of tiny, unseen beings at play. Strange flowers blooming overnight, mushrooms growing in perfect circles, or peculiar animal behavior were often credited to the intervention of these spirits. Children, especially, were taught caution. Stepping on a fairy ring or plucking a mysterious flower could invite misfortune. In this way, fairies became both moral guides and explanations for nature's secrets, blending beauty with caution in daily life. Even common animals contributed to these beliefs. Birds singing in the morning could be messengers of the fairies, and small woodland creatures were sometimes thought to be enchanted forms of humans or spirits. People might leave offerings of milk or bread at the edge of a forest, hoping to appease these beings, or perform small rituals to honor the unseen. Such practices reinforced respect for the environment, embedding an early understanding of stewardship in the form of legend. By turning natural curiosity into stories, villagers created a narrative that made the world feel alive with mystery, and humans became participants in that magic rather than mere observers. These tales also intersected with festivals and seasonal events, the turning of the seasons, the first bloom of spring, or the harvest moon were celebrated with stories of fairy gatherings, dances, and blessings for crops or livestock. Music, dance, and feasting accompanied these narratives, creating a culture in which myth and reality intertwined seamlessly. For every unexplained phenomena, missing chicken, a sudden wind, or a hidden path revealed in the woods there was a fairy tale. A story that provided a framework for understanding and responding to the world. The blend of fear, joy, and reverence made these legends an essential part of community life. While enchanting, the world of fairies also carried cautionary lessons. Villagers believed that angering these spirits could result in illness, misfortune, or even death. A child wandering alone might be taken by the fairies, returning only after a night or two with no memory of the experience. Pregnant women were advised against walking alone near certain glades, and travelers carried charms to ward off mischievous spirits. These narratives, while fantastical, encouraged mindfulness, respect, and social cohesion, shaping behavior in ways that were both practical and moralistic. The interplay of imagination and observation was crucial. Natural events that were beyond immediate understanding bioluminescence, sudden storms, or unexpected animal migrations, were explained through the presence of fairies and spirits. In this way, the legends were grounded in reality even as they stretched beyond it. The glow in a dewy meadow, the whisper of wind through the trees, or the sudden rustle of a bush at twilight became evidence of an unseen, magical presence. These stories, passed down through generations, created a world in which the mundane became magical, and every forest edge held the promise of wonder or warning. At night, the villagers were still, yet alive with the memory of these tales. Candles flickered in windows, and the wind carried the faint sounds of the forest, as if whispering secrets to those willing to listen. Children dreamt of dancing lights and tiny figures hiding among flowers, while adults remembered the lessons of caution, respect, and care. The fairies and nature spirits were never truly seen, yet they were felt everywhere, woven into the fabric of life and imagination. In the medieval mind, magic was not separate from reality. It was a lens through which the world made sense, a way to navigate the mysteries of life, and a reminder that even the smallest things could hold wonder, danger, and profound meaning. As night fell across medieval villages, a different kind of story took shape when whispered from door to door, from hearth to hearth, in the dim glow of candlelight. These were tales of ghosts, of restless spirits that lingered among the living, and of houses or castles that no human should enter after dusk. A moan through the wind, a shadow flitting across a wall, or the inexplicable movement of a simple object could all signal the presence of the dead. In a world where death was close and sudden, where life was fragile and the unknown vast, ghosts were not merely stories. They were reminders of mortality, of past sins, and of forces unseen that demanded attention. Haunted houses and abandoned castles were the most fertile ground for these tales. People reported hearing footsteps in empty halls, doors opening and closing on their own, and glimpses of figures with hollow eyes and pale faces. In many cases, these phenomena had simple explanations: the creak of timber in settling structures, drafts whistling through cracks, or animals moving unseen in the dark. Yet, in the minds of the villagers, the ordinary became extraordinary, amplified by fear and imagination. A rocking chair shifting on its own became a ghostly visitor, and distant echoes in a stone corridor were interpreted as a spectral warning. The origins of these stories were often practical as well as psychological. Grief, guilt, and anxiety manifested in ways that made the supernatural seem real. A widow mourning by candlelight might interpret a shadow as the returning form of her husband. Children, left alone for brief moments, might glimpse something in the corner of their eye and be convinced of a ghostly presence, even in the absence of direct sightings. Rumors of haunted places served as warnings to respect boundaries, avoid danger, and maintain caution in potentially hazardous areas. In this way, myth and behavior reinforced one another, creating a social framework built on fear and prudence. Ghost stories also reflected deeper societal concerns. Castles, especially, were places of power, intrigue, and violence. The spectral figures reported in these locations were often associated with past crimes, betrayals, or tragedies. A lord's violent past might manifest in stories of apparitions pacing the halls, ensuring that the memory of injustice endured beyond death. These legends allowed communities to process trauma collectively, creating narratives that preserved memory while giving shape to abstract fears. In villages, tales of wandering spirits or cursed houses became both entertainment and moral lesson, a blend of cautionary tale and fascination with the unknown. Environmental factors played a large role in shaping these legends. Thick fog, moonlight, the howling of wolves, and the rustling of trees could all be interpreted as signs of the supernatural, even simple acoustic phenomena, like the echo of voices in narrow streets or the shifting of wind through a ruined tower, added layers to the story. Villagers with little scientific understanding interpreted these cues through the lens of legend, giving physical form to fears that were as intangible as the night itself. The result was a rich tapestry in which reality and imagination were intertwined, each lending credibility to the other. Despite the fear, ghost stories held a subtle beauty. They connected the living with the past, reminding people of ancestors, of history, and of the passage of time. Offerings placed at crossroads, prayers whispered at graves, and rituals performed to appease spirits created a sense of participation in a world larger than the immediate village. In this interplay of fear and reverence, the supernatural became a guide, shaping behavior, encouraging respect for the dead, and embedding moral lessons within the fabric of everyday life. Ghosts were not only feared, they were a thread that tied the living to the stories of those who had come before, and in that way, they were deeply real. By night, when the wind carried the faint sound of distant footsteps, and the shadows of gnarled trees stretched across cobblestone streets, villagers felt the presence of something beyond the ordinary. Every flickering candle, every shifting shadow, became part of the story, a reminder that the medieval world was alive with mystery. In this way, the line between myth and reality blurred. The living coexisted with the dead in a landscape shaped by imagination, grief, and the human need to explain the unexplained. And so, the tales of ghosts and haunted places endured, whispered from one generation to the next, a testament to the power of fear, wonder, and the human imagination. In medieval villages, illness was a constant companion, and cures were a blend of observation, tradition, and a touch of magic. Every home, from the humblest cottage to the wealthiest manor, contained remedies passed down through generations. Herbs were gathered from forests and fields, each with properties believed to heal, protect, or ward off evil. Fever, wounds, infections, and even unexplained maladies were treated with poultices, infusions, and amulets. To the villagers, medicine and magic were inseparable. Herb could soothe the body, but a charm or prayer ensured that the unseen forces did not undo the cure. Common herbs like chamomile, thyme, and rosemary were staples, valued for both their practical and symbolic qualities. Chamomile eased fevers and promoted sleep, while rosemary was thought to strengthen the heart and protect against evil spirits. Even plants like garlic had dual purposes. They were used to season food and to repel vampires, witches, or malevolent spirits. Every plant had a story, and each story carried a lesson about respect for nature, careful observation, and the thin line between healing and harm. Villagers learned which plants grew best in which season, how to prepare them, and how to combine ritual with remedy, creating a delicate balance between science and superstition. Beyond herbs, villagers relied on charms, amulets, and incantations. A stitched pouch filled with dried flowers, salt, or small coins could protect a child from illness, while reciting prayers over a wound was believed to ensure that it healed properly. In some cases, these rituals had tangible effects, focusing attention on a patient, applying a poultice carefully, and maintaining cleanliness could prevent infection, even if the understanding of disease was rudimentary. The magic was as much psychological as practical, offering comfort and hope in a world where sickness could strike suddenly and without warning. Local healers and wise women became central figures in the community. They combined knowledge of plants, animal products, and traditional practices to treat ailments, earning respect and sometimes suspicion. Stories circulated of miraculous cures, of herbs that stopped bleeding, or of oils that could ease pain. But equally, tales of failure, of treatments gone wrong, reinforced the sense that healing was intertwined with forces beyond human control. People approached these remedies with both hope and caution, aware that success could feel miraculous, while failure might seem like a curse. Even in times of epidemic, these magical remedies played a vital role. In the absence of doctors or formal medical knowledge, Communities relied on what they had: observation, folklore, and ritual. Herbs were gathered from sacred groves, charms were crafted with care, and prayers were spoken with devotion. Villagers believed that illness could be caused not only by imbalance in the body but by malevolent forces, angered spirits, or curses. Treatments, therefore, addressed both the physical and the spiritual, merging observation with belief, medicine with magic, and hope with fear. At night, the homes of the villagers were alive with these practices. Candles flickered over bowls of herbal mixtures, while the scent of simmering roots and flowers filled the air. Families gathered to watch healers at work, listening to chants, songs, or instructions. The combination of ritual and remedy created a sense of control in a world full of uncertainty. Every poultice applied, every herb brewed, every charm placed was a small battle against the unseen, a way to assert mastery over forces that were both real and imagined. In this delicate dance between knowledge and superstition, medieval people navigated illness, pain, and fear, crafting a world where healing was as much about belief as it was about reality. In medieval villages, fear often took a human form. Tales circulated of witches, women and occasionally men accused of cursing crops, livestock, and neighbors. These individuals were said to wield dark powers, capable of bending fate and invoking misfortune. A sudden illness, a failed harvest, or even a string of accidents might be blamed on a hidden curse, and the accused were often powerless to defend themselves. Witches became symbols of chaos and malevolence, embodying the fears and frustrations of communities struggling with forces they could not control. The origins of these stories were deeply intertwined with social realities. Disagreements between neighbors, envy, and suspicion could easily transform into accusations of witchcraft. A midwife whose remedies failed, a woman living alone with knowledge of herbs, or someone unusually knowledgeable in local traditions could be suspected. These accusations provided explanations for misfortune, offering a sense of control in uncertain times. If the world seemed capricious or cruel, it was easier to believe that a person or a curse was behind it, rather than randomness or natural cause. Evidence for curses was often circumstantial, and fear amplified perception. A sick child could be explained as the work of a neighbor. Issei, spoiled grain was a witch's doing. Symbols, rituals, and charms were employed to detect and neutralize these supposed threats. Iron, salt, and protective incantations became tools of defense, blending practicality with superstition. In this way, daily life was infused with vigilance, caution, and ritualized behavior, all designed to guard against unseen harm. People learned to negotiate the real and imagined threats, constantly aware that misfortune could be human or supernatural in origin. Despite the fear, these tales also served social and moral functions. They reinforced communal norms, encouraging obedience, caution, and humility. Warnings about witches taught children to respect elders, follow rules, and avoid dangerous places. For adults, the stories offered ways to navigate social conflict. Accusing someone of witchcraft could be both a defense mechanism and a method of asserting authority. In Tis Sensei, myths of curses and witchcraft were deeply functional, shaping behavior, reinforcing hierarchy, and providing a narrative framework for understanding misfortune. The environment also contributed to the mythos. Long shadows, flickering candlelight, and sudden storms created atmospheres ripe for interpretation. People's senses were heightened by the fear of unseen forces. A sudden scream from the forest, a candle that flickered without wind, or an animal behaving oddly could be seen as a sign of witchcraft. In villages, stories of curses spread quickly, transforming ordinary events into cautionary tales. The imagination, sharpened by superstition, created a feedback loop where fear validated myth and myth justified fear. At night, villagers acted with both caution and ritual. ERBs were hung over doors, iron implements were placed near beds, and prayers were whispered over children. These actions combined protection with symbolic meaning, creating a sense of agency in a world where the unknown seemed overwhelmingly powerful. Witches and curses were not merely stories, they were practical, psychological, and social instruments woven into the fabric of daily life. They allowed communities to interpret accidents, illnesses, and misfortune, giving shape to chaos and grounding human experience in a framework of narrative and belief. In the end, the tales of curses and witchcraft endured because they reflected real human concerns. They were about fear, envy, mortality, and the struggle to control one's environment. They reminded people that misfortune might have a cause, even if that cause was imagined, and that vigilance, ritual, and respect for tradition could offer protection. In medieval minds, curses were both real and symbolic, bridging the gap between the known and unknown, and giving meaning to the uncertainties of life. These legends, whispered from one generation to the next, became a testament to human ingenuity in confronting fear, danger, and the mysteries of existence. In the heart of medieval Europe, forests were not merely places of trees and wildlife, they were realms of mystery, danger, and imagination. Villagers rarely ventured deep into the woods, for stories told of hidden pitfalls, treacherous marshes, and spirits that lingered among the shadows. A path could disappear into brambles, and a sudden fog could transform the familiar into the unknown. These forests were alive in legend as much as they were in reality, a place where imagination and danger coexisted, teaching caution and respect for the untamed world. Stories of haunted forests were widespread. Travelers claimed to have seen glowing lights dancing between trees, heard footsteps behind them when no one was there, or encountered strange creatures lurking in the underbrush. To the villagers, these tales were not mere entertainment. They were warnings. A misstep could lead to a broken limb, a hidden sinkhole, or a night lost in the wilderness. The supernatural elements of these stories amplified real dangers, making the lessons unforgettable. Every whisper of wind, every rustle of leaves, became a story waiting to be told, a lesson woven into the fabric of survival. Danger was often tangible. Wolves prowled the edges of villages, bears ventured into farmlands, and venomous snakes could strike in hidden undergrowth. Unexplained terrain. Sudden storms and dense foliage made navigation difficult. Villagers learned to respect these spaces, marking trails carefully, traveling in groups, and avoiding unfamiliar routes after dusk. Their fear was both practical and cultural, entwining real threats with the power of narrative. A lost traveler might claim to have been taken by a forest, but the reality was that terrain, weather, and exhaustion were just as lethal as the imagined spirits. The supernatural stories were inseparable from the natural landscape. Willow trees became sentinels of spirits. Ancient oaks were believed to hide fairies or ghosts, and mist rising from a river at dawn could be interpreted as the breath of unseen beings. Villagers created rituals to protect themselves, hanging herbs on doors, reciting prayers, or leaving offerings at forest edges. These practices reinforced community cohesion and respect for the environment, blending superstition with practical wisdom. Fear taught lessons that no amount of instruction could convey, and the forest became a living classroom for observation, caution, and imagination. Even experienced travelers contributed to the lore. Tales of people disappearing, strange sounds in the night, or animals behaving unusually spread quickly, and each retelling grew taller. What began as cautionary advice often evolved into ghostly encounters or monstrous sightings. The imagination of the medieval mind filled in the gaps between observation and explanation. Every shadow could conceal a wolf, a phantom, or a fairy, and every flicker of light could signal enchantment or danger. In this way, the forests of Europe were both real and imagined, physical spaces imbued with layers of cultural meaning and human fear. By night, the forests were transformed. Moonlight filtering through the canopy created patterns that seemed alive, and every movement of leaves or branches hinted at hidden presences. Travelers relied on memory, instinct, and story to navigate, knowing that the woods demanded respect. The legends of haunted landscapes and dangerous paths were not merely fancy-fueled, they were survival tools, teaching vigilance, caution, and humility in a world where the line between safety and peril was thin. The medieval forest was a place of wonder and fear, a natural theater where myth and reality met, and every step carried both risk and the thrill of the unknown. In the annals of medieval Europe, tales of monstrous creatures and rare animals captivated imaginations as much as they terrified. Villagers spoke of enormous beasts seen in distant lands, creatures with horns, scales, or multiple heads. These stories traveled slowly from port towns to remote hamlets, often exaggerated by each retelling. An animal glimpsed at the edge of a forest might grow into a dragon. A whale sighted at sea could become a leviathan in the mind of someone who had never ventured beyond the coast. Reality and imagination intertwined, creating a world in which the exotic and the terrifying were inseparable. Explorers and traders brought back sketches and descriptions of animals unknown to Europeans. Giraffes, elephants, and rhinoceroses were subjects of awe and speculation. The lack of direct experience led to embellishments. Horns became spikes, tusks grew into weapons, and unusual patterns on skins transformed into scales. In villages, these accounts were told around fires, and children shivered at the thought of beasts that could consume a man in a single bite. Scholars and chroniclers debated the existence of these creatures, blending observation with folklore, while peasants integrated these stories into local superstition. Sometimes, ordinary animals became the subjects of extraordinary tales. A wolf unusually large or aggressive could be described as a werewolf or a forest demon. Crocodiles from faraway rivers might be imagined as lurking in the deepest lakes of Europe. Even bears and boars, familiar to villagers, took on legendary proportions in the context of fear and wonder. People created charms, prayers, and rituals to protect themselves from these beasts, reflecting both practical caution and the power of narrative to shape behavior. The line between real threat and imagined terror was blurred, yet both served a purpose: survival and moral education. These stories also reinforced curiosity and exploration. Maps began to include "Here be dragons" in regions unknown, symbolizing not only danger but the allure of the unfamiliar. Children and adults alike were taught lessons about the limits of human knowledge, the respect owed to nature, and the consequences of venturing too far into the unknown. Myths of monsters served as cautionary tales as well as vessels for wonder, preparing minds to navigate a world that was vast, unpredictable, and filled with unseen marvels. Interestingly, these tales had a psychological function. Fear of monstrous creatures helped communities remain alert, ensuring they respected wild animals and hazardous terrain. At the same time, the fascination with the exotic sparked imagination, creativity, and the desire to document and explore. Paintings, tapestries, and manuscripts depicted these creatures with intricate detail, blurring the line between observation and artistic interpretation. In this way, the medieval mind embraced both terror and curiosity, allowing monsters to exist simultaneously in the realms of reality and legend. By night, the fires in cottages cast long shadows, and every rustle of leaves in the forest could suggest the approach of a mythical beast. Villagers kept watch, wary of the extraordinary lurking just beyond their perception. In this interplay of fear and wonder, reality and imagination merged seamlessly. Medieval Europe became a place where rare animals and monstrous creatures coexisted in stories and minds, where curiosity sparked caution, and where the unknown inspired both terror and awe. It was a world in which the natural and the fantastical were inseparable, and every shadow might hold a story waiting to be told. In medieval times, stories of giants, humans of immense size, towering above ordinary men, were as captivating as they were terrifying. Villagers spoke of men who could uproot trees, stride across rivers, and wield weapons as large as houses. These tales were shared around fires, whispered in markets, and recorded in manuscripts. They were a way to understand the extraordinary, a human attempt to explain beings that seemed to defy the natural order. Giants became both symbols of power and cautionary tales, embodying awe, fear, and curiosity all at once. The origins of these legends were often rooted in reality. Rare cases of gigantism or acromegaly produced individuals of exceptional height or unusual physical features. A man reaching 9 or 10 feet in height could easily inspire stories of superhuman strength and deeds. Skeletal remains, misidentified or exaggerated, fueled the imagination. An unusually large skull or bone could be claimed as evidence of an ancient giant, and travelers' accounts of distant lands contributed to the lore. Over time, the ordinary became extraordinary, and observation merged seamlessly with exaggeration. Giants were not merely creatures of folklore, they were a canvas for human fears and aspirations. They represented forces beyond control: natural disasters, war, famine, and the unknown. Their immense size symbolized power that could not be matched, reinforcing lessons about humility, obedience, and respect for authority. Stories of giants often included moral or cautionary elements. Those who challenged the giant might be punished, or those who observed their strength could learn a lesson about prudence and strategy. In this way, myths were both entertaining and instructive, shaping behavior as much as imagination. In some regions, tales of giants were intertwined with historical figures or legendary heroes. Ancient kings, warriors, or invaders might be described as enormous beings, their deeds magnified to fit the narrative. This blending of history and myth created a rich tapestry in which giant humans were plausible yet wondrous, real yet symbolic. Villagers could reconcile the fantastic with the familiar, understanding giants as reflections of both the human potential and the dangers that lay beyond comprehension. The boundary between reality and legend was flexible, allowing giants to exist in the minds and stories of all ages. Even the landscape played a role. Large stones, unusual rock formations, and ancient ruins were often attributed to giants, claimed to be the work of their hands. This gave the environment a narrative quality, making every hill, river, or cave a potential scene of extraordinary feats. Children and travelers grew up learning to respect these spaces, imagining the immense figures who once walked the land. The world was imbued with scale and wonder, where human experience was dwarfed by imagination, and every shadow or mound could carry the memory of a giant. By night, villagers would gather to share these stories. Shadows flickered on the walls, and the smallest movements could be reinterpreted as the remnants of a giant's step. These tales connected generations, linking the present to imagined or remembered pasts, and grounding awe and fear in narrative. Giants were never simply fantasies. They were a way to explore limits, to understand strength, and to navigate a world where the extraordinary might be hiding just beyond sight. In medieval Europe, the giant was both real and imagined, a testament to human curiosity, fear, and the endless desire to tell stories about beings larger than life. In the medieval world, the sea was as much a source of fear as it was of sustenance. Sailors spoke of monstrous creatures lurking beneath the waves. Creatures so immense that their backs could resemble small islands, and their eyes shine like lanterns in the dark. These sea monsters, or leviathans, were said to capsize ships, devour fishermen, and drag entire crews into the depths. To the villagers and sailors alike, the ocean was alive with hidden dangers, and tales of its monstrous inhabitants served as warnings and lessons, blending observation with imagination. Many of these stories arose from real encounters. Giant squids, whales, and unfamiliar fish often appeared suddenly, their size and unfamiliar forms sparking awe and fear. A breaching whale might be mistaken for a sea dragon, and floating debris could look like the remnants of a creature's back. Storms added to the terror, waves tossing ships and creating illusions in the spray and foam. Sailors, lacking scientific understanding, interpreted these phenomena as evidence of supernatural sea beasts. Tales grew with each retelling, merging fear, imagination, and real danger into compelling narratives. The tales also reflected the uncertainty and isolation of life at sea. Navigating unknown waters, sailors relied on experience, instinct, and shared stories to survive. A misstep could mean death, and monsters provided a narrative framework to understand losses and tragedies. If a ship disappeared in a storm, it was easier to believe in a giant sea creature than to confront the randomness of nature. In this way, myths became both educational and cautionary, teaching respect for the sea's power and reinforcing communal memory of danger. These legends also serve to explain the unexplainable. Floating masses of seaweed, unusual waves, and sudden whirlpools were all interpreted as signs of a creature below the surface. Sailors, tales, often accompanied by sketches, added detail and drama, which spread rapidly through ports and coastal villages. Villagers who had never seen the ocean themselves passed down these stories, embellishing them with additional horrors and wonders. The result was a shared cultural understanding of the sea as a place of mystery, danger, and extraordinary phenomena. Even the smallest encounters inspired myth. A large fish leaping near a boat, a pod of dolphins behaving unusually, or a glowing jellyfish could spark stories of enchantment, warning, or disaster. Superstition intertwined with observation, creating a landscape of imagination that both educated and terrified. At night, when the horizon was shrouded in mist and the sound of waves echoed against wooden hulls, sailors believed they could sense something enormous lurking below. The sea became a living entity, teeming with monsters both real and imagined, a place where fear, wonder, and survival intersected in every tale. By the fireside, villagers would listen to these stories with a mixture of awe and dread. The sea, distant yet integral to life, became a symbol of the unknown, a repository for human imagination and collective fear. Tales of leviathans and sea monsters persisted because they explained danger, taught respect, and inspired caution, while also captivating minds with visions of the extraordinary. In medieval Europe, the ocean was more than water. It was a stage for legend, a mirror of human curiosity, and a reminder that even the familiar world could hold unimaginable mysteries beneath its surface. Dragons were perhaps the most enduring of medieval myths, terrifying and awe-inspiring in equal measure. Villagers whispered of colossal reptiles with scales harder than steel, wings that blotted out the sun, and the ability to breathe fire. Their lairs were said to be hidden in mountains, caves, or deep forests, filled with treasure and guarded fiercely. Dragons were symbols of danger and greed, of the unknown and the embodying humanity's fascination with power, destruction, and the supernatural. The stories of dragons often originated from real observations, though exaggerated over time. Fossilized bones of large reptiles or unknown animals were sometimes mistaken for dragon remains. Rare sightings of monitor lizards, large snakes, or other unusual creatures inspired tales of enormous beasts. Even natural phenomena such as lightning striking a mountain, volcanic eruptions, or unusual fires were attributed to dragons, giving the myth a physical grounding. In this way, imagination and reality merged seamlessly, creating legends that were both captivating and cautionary. Dragons also served symbolic purposes. They were obstacles for heroes in stories representing challenges that required courage, intelligence, and moral strength to overcome. Knights and warriors were said to slay dragons to protect their villages, win honor, or recover lost treasures. These narratives provided moral lessons, reinforcing ideals of bravery, resourcefulness, and justice. Villagers internalized these stories, understanding dragons as both literal and metaphorical threats, and used the tales to teach children about danger, vigilance, and virtue. The physical landscape reinforced these stories. Mountain caves, rocky cliffs, and dense forests were idealized as dragon lairs. Fires from natural causes, forest fires, sparks from volcanic activity, or even large bonfires were interpreted as dragons breathing flame. Glowing eyes seen in the dark might have been wolves, owls, or other nocturnal creatures. Yet they became evidence of a lurking dragon in the minds of villagers. This blending of observation, misinterpretation, and imagination strengthened the belief in dragons and made the myth tangible. Dragons also captured the imagination of scholars, artists, and storytellers. Manuscripts depicted them with intricate scales, fiery breath, and immense wings, while oral traditions spread tales of their cunning, destructive power, and treasure hoards. These stories were shared in villages, castles, and markets, influencing architecture, art, and folklore. A child growing up hearing of dragons would learn lessons about courage, fear, and respect for the unknown, while adults recognized them as metaphors for natural dangers, human greed, and the challenges of life itself. At night, the mountains and forests seemed alive with possibility. Shadows cast by the moon, the sound of distant storms, or the glint of sunlight on jagged rocks could all be interpreted as signs of dragon presence. Villagers remained cautious, their stories embedding both practical wisdom and imaginative awe into daily life. Dragons were never entirely absent from the medieval mind. They represented the unknown, the formidable, and the fantastical, ensuring that the human spirit remained alert, curious, and respectful of the world's hidden wonders. In medieval Europe, treasure was often more dangerous in legend than in reality. Villagers spoke of chests of gold, jewel-encrusted relics, and ancient artifacts that carried curses. A coin touched by the wrong hand could bring misfortune. A gem stolen from a sacred place could doom its possessor, and ancient weapons were said to carry the wrath of those who had died wielding them. These tales blended awe, greed, and fear, teaching lessons about respect, humility, and the consequences of human desire. The origins of these stories were sometimes grounded in truth. Buried hoards were occasionally discovered, often by accident, revealing coins, jewelry, or weaponry from past centuries. Misfortune that followed these discoveries, whether illness, injury, or social conflict, was interpreted as evidence of a curse. Environmental hazards, poor handling, or coincidence contributed to the narrative. A simple misstep while digging for treasure might result in a broken leg or an encounter with wildlife. Yet the medieval mind often explained such events as the work of unseen forces guarding the wealth. Cursed artifacts were not limited to gold and jewels. Religious relics, ceremonial weapons, and statues could carry the same warnings. A chalice taken from a distant monastery might be said to bring illness to those who touched it improperly. An ancient sword displayed in a lord's hall could be associated with the violent death of its original owner. These narratives served multiple purposes. They deterred theft, reinforced religious or moral norms, and provided a framework for understanding misfortune. The stories were as much about ethics as they were about fear, teaching that respect and caution were as valuable as wealth itself. Even ordinary objects could acquire legendary status. A ring, a mirror, or a book might be considered cursed, especially if previous owners had suffered misfortune. Tales of these items spread quickly, shared around fires, markets, and taverns. Communities absorbed the lessons embedded in these stories, blending caution with fascination. Children learned early that human desire could have consequences beyond the immediate, and adults recognized that greed or carelessness could bring harm, whether through natural cause or imagined curse. The power of these legends lay in their blend of mystery and reality. Environmental hazards, social conflict, and human error created real consequences, while imagination and storytelling added layers of meaning. A treasure buried in a remote forest could be dangerous, not only because of the terrain, but because of the fear, superstition, and expectation surrounding it. This interplay made cursed artifacts a compelling part of medieval life, connecting the ordinaries with the extraordinaries, the seen with the unseen, and desire with consequence. Treasure, and these tales, was never merely wealth. It was a lesson, a warning, and a story waiting to unfold. At night, fires flickered over maps and sketches of hidden hoards. Families listened intently as elders recounted tales of cursed gold, lost jewels, and haunted relics. The stories reinforced vigilance, caution, and respect for both people and the unknown forces of the world. Medieval communities understood that wealth and power could come with hidden costs, and the legends of cursed artifacts ensured that these lessons endured. Treasure, myth, and morality intertwined, creating a tapestry of narrative that was as instructive as it was thrilling. In medieval Europe, disease was an omnipresent fear, a force that struck suddenly and often without warning. Villagers whispered of plagues that descended from the heavens, curses that spread through the air, and punishments for sins committed long ago. Illnesses were mysterious and terrifying, and without scientific understanding, people turned to explanations that combined religion, superstition, and imagination. Every cough, every rash, and every sudden death was interpreted through a lens of fear, morality, and the unknown. The Black Death and other plagues were devastating realities that inspired countless stories. Entire households could be wiped out, leaving the survivors terrified and desperate. Villagers sought explanations that made sense in a world without germ theory. Some believed the disease was punishment from God. Others thought it was caused by witches or cursed objects. And still others feared that the stars themselves had shifted, bringing sickness to the land. These beliefs shaped behavior, from quarantine to ritual, and gave structure to a world suddenly chaotic. Practical measures often merged with superstition. Herbs such as sage, rosemary, and garlic were burned to cleanse the air, while charms and amulets were worn to ward off invisible forces. Pilgrimages and prayers were undertaken to appease deities, and communities adhered to rituals meant to protect them from unseen threats. Even when these measures were ineffective, The act of performing them provided comfort, a sense of agency against a seemingly unstoppable enemy. Human fear became entwined with human action, creating patterns that were as cultural as they were protective. Social consequences were profound. Villagers reacted with both solidarity and suspicion. Neighbors might avoid those who were sick, while at the same time, communities cared for the ill as best they could. Stories of contagion and cure spread rapidly, shaping the collective imagination. Quarantines, isolation, and restrictions emerged not only from practical necessity but also from belief in unseen causes of illness. A person displaying symptoms could be feared as a carrier of a curse, just as much as they were a victim of disease. The psychological impact was immense. Fear heightened perception, making ordinary sounds, shadows, and bodily changes seem ominous. Every visitor, every bird or animal, every change in the environment could be linked to impending sickness. These narratives allowed people to impose meaning on randomness, giving structure to a chaotic world. Plagues, though terrifyingly real, became stories of morality, caution, and human vulnerability, reminding everyone of the thin line between life and death. Even as death hovered over villages, these stories endured, teaching lessons about vigilance, humility, and compassion. Children were warned about sickness and taught rituals of cleanliness and prayer, while adults balanced fear with care and survival. In this interplay of reality and imagination, medieval communities navigated the uncertainties of disease, creating a culture where caution, belief, and observation coexisted. The plagues were more than biological events. They were narrative forces, shaping human behavior, belief, and the stories that would be passed down for generations. In medieval villages, festivals were more than celebrations. They were intersections of joy, ritual, and belief in the unseen. Communities marked the changing seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, and religious observances with gatherings that combined music, dance, and feasting. Yet beneath the revelry lay a deep connection to supernatural belief. People believed that spirits, fairies, and unseen forces were active during these times, and rituals ensured protection, favor, and balance with the mystical world. Spring festivals, for example, often honored fertility, growth, and renewal. Villagers would light bonfires, dance around maypoles, and hang flowers on doors and windows. These acts were not merely decorative, they were believed to ward off malevolent spirits and encourage the prosperity of crops and livestock. Masks, costumes, and exaggerated performances symbolized the power of transformation and the thin line between the human and the supernatural. Children learned to respect these forces, while adults engaged in communal storytelling and ritual, blending celebration with caution. Harvest festivals carried similar layers of meaning. While the bounty of the fields was cause for rejoicing, there were also rituals to appease spirits thought to guard the land. Farmers would leave portions of grain or fruit in the fields as offerings, a practice rooted in both gratitude and fear. Tales circulated of unseen watchers who could either bless the harvest or bring misfortune. Villages navigated these events with a mixture of joy and vigilance, understanding that luck, labor, and supernatural favor were intertwined in daily life. Religious festivals similarly combined celebration with belief in unseen forces. Saints' days, processions, and holy feasts involved prayers, offerings, and symbolic acts meant to secure protection from illness, disaster, or misfortune. Villagers believed that their participation could influence events beyond their control, from weather to personal fortune. Songs, stories, and performances often depicted moral lessons, supernatural encounters, or heroic deeds, reinforcing social norms, while connecting the community to larger, mysterious forces. Even seemingly playful traditions contained elements of caution and respect. Children wearing masks, performers enacting spirits or monsters, and competitions of skill and wit all reminded participants that the world was filled with unseen influences. Humor, fear, and awe intertwined, creating an atmosphere where learning, observation, and imagination coexisted. The supernatural was not separate from life, it was woven into every dance, song, and fire, shaping perceptions of reality and reinforcing communal bonds. Through these festivals, villagers experienced a balance between joy and vigilance, ordinary life and supernatural awareness. Music and laughter blended with ritual and superstition, forging connections between generations and between the human and mystical worlds. Medieval festivals were microcosms of the society itself, vibrant, cautious, imaginative, and deeply intertwined with belief. They demonstrated that even in moments of celebration, humans have always sought to understand and respect the forces beyond their sight, blending wonder, joy, and caution into the rhythm of communal life. Medieval castles were more than fortifications, they were centers of power, symbols of prestige, and stages for legend. Across Urope tales of haunted halls, restless spirits, and tragic nobles circulated among villagers and travelers alike. Dark corridors, hidden chambers, and cold stone walls created an atmosphere ripe for stories of betrayal, murder, and restless souls. To the inhabitants and observers, these castles were alive with memory and mystery, a place where history and imagination intertwined seamlessly. Many legends had roots in real events. Feuds between noble families, sudden deaths, and political intrigues provided fertile ground for ghost stories. A lord murdered by a rival might be said to haunt the halls where he once dined, while servants who disappeared under mysterious circumstances became the subject of eerie tales. The architecture itself, with towering turrets, narrow staircases, and echoing chambers, amplified fear. Shadows stretched long under torchlight, and every creaking door or distant footstep could become evidence of a presence from beyond the grave. Haunted castles served social and moral purposes. Stories reinforced caution and respect, reminding both nobles and peasants that actions carried consequences. Tales of betrayal and murder warned against deceit, cruelty, and ambition unchecked by virtue. For villagers, the legends offered entertainment, moral instruction, and a framework for understanding events that might otherwise seem random or terrifying. Every tale of a ghostly noblewoman or a weeping child taught lessons about empathy, courage, and vigilance. The natural environment also contributed to the mythos. Mist rolling over moats, storms battering ramparts, and owls hooting from battlements created conditions ripe for supernatural interpretation. Even ordinary noises, rustling tapestries, wind through narrow windows, or shifting stones were interpreted as spectral activity. Castles were places of imagination as much as reality, and the interplay between sensory perception and storytelling ensured that legends flourished over generations. Visitors, travelers, and chroniclers often amplified these stories. A single sighting of a shadowy figure could grow into a narrative of a full-fledged haunting, complete with motives, history, and elaborate description. Paintings, manuscripts, and oral tradition preserved these accounts, making the castles centers not only of power but of legend. Children growing up in nearby villages learned to respect the ancient structures, viewing them as both protective and dangerous, inhabited by the past as much as the living. In essence, haunted castles were reflections of human history, fear, and imagination. They were physical reminders of mortality, ambition, and consequence, and their legends offered a means to navigate complex social, political, and moral landscapes. For medieval people, these stories were not merely entertainment. They were tools for understanding, teaching, and surviving in a world where danger and mystery were ever present. The stone walls echoed with the weight of memory, ensuring that the stories of the past remained alive in the minds of all who dared approach. Medieval heroes were the embodiment of courage, skill, and human imagination. Villagers spoke of knights who faced dragons, battled witches, or defended their lands from supernatural threats. These tales blended reality and legend, often exaggerating the feats of actual warriors to include fantastic creatures and magical powers. In a time when survival depended on both physical skill and cunning, such stories served as inspiration, education, and entertainment all at once. The origins of these tales often lay in true events. Knights and soldiers demonstrated exceptional bravery in battles, duels, or sieges, a particularly daring feat saving a village, defeating a band of invaders, or surviving a dangerous journey could be recast in narrative form as a confrontation with a dragon, a cursed knight, or a spectral army. Ordinary courage was transformed into extraordinary heroism, allowing communities to celebrate and remember their protectors in vivid and memorable ways. Supernatural elements amplified these stories. A warrior might wield a sword said to be blessed by a saint, or armor rumored to deflect magical attacks. Enemies could be described as giants, monsters, or sorcerers, making every encounter both a test of physical ability and moral character. These embellishments provided moral lessons. Courage, loyalty, and virtue were rewarded, while cowardice, deceit, or cruelty led to failure. Stories of heroes battling the unknown offered guidance on ethics, bravery, and human potential. Villagers internalized these tales as part of their cultural fabric. Children grew up listening to accounts of valor and ingenuity, learning lessons about the consequences of choices and the value of preparation, courage, and wisdom. Adults recognized the practical basis of these stories: strategy, intelligence, and physical skill, but the mythical layer made them memorable and motivational. Heroes were both aspirational figures and models of behavior, blending imagination with practical instruction. The landscape itself played a role in heroism. Mountains, forests, and rivers became arenas for legendary battles, where natural obstacles were as dangerous as enemies. Castles, towns, and hidden paths provided stages for these adventures, grounding them in reality while allowing room for fantasy. Villagers could point to familiar places and recount legendary deeds, connecting personal experience to epic narrative, and ensuring that the stories were both believable and enthralling. Ultimately, medieval heroes and their supernatural battles represented humanity's desire to confront fear, overcome danger, and achieve greatness. The blending of real courage with imaginative elements created a tapestry of legend that taught, inspired, and entertained. In the fireside storytelling of villages, these heroes came alive, reminding everyone that bravery and wisdom could prevail even against the most unimaginable challenges. They were a bridge between human capability and human imagination, where history and myth met to shape culture, morality, and aspiration. Medieval myths were more than stories told for entertainment. They were the vessels through which knowledge, caution, and moral lessons were passed down through generations. Villagers, scholars, and travelers all participated in this shared narrative, weaving together reality and imagination to create a framework for understanding the world. Dragons, haunted castles, cursed artifacts, and heroes' adventures were not just tales, were guides for behavior, reflections of society, and mirrors of human fear and aspiration. The lessons of these myths were manifold: fear taught vigilance, caution in forests, respect for rivers, and wariness of strangers. Courage inspired action. Heroes and knights demonstrated that bravery could overcome both human and supernatural threats. Morality reinforced community cohesion. Tales of greed, deceit, or cruelty often led to punishment, while virtue, honesty, and cleverness were rewarded. Through storytelling, knowledge of the environment, survival strategies, and social norms were embedded into cultural memory. Myths also bridged imagination and observation. Unusual animals, strange geological formations, or natural phenomena could be explained through stories, making the unknown less terrifying and more comprehensible. A roaring river could be inhabited by spirits. A cave could hide dragons. A shadowy forest could contain both danger and opportunity. By blending reality with imagination, medieval people developed a rich understanding of their surroundings, while cultivating creativity, curiosity, and moral reasoning. Communities grew stronger through shared narratives. Festivals, fireside storytelling, and songs reinforced lessons learned from myths. Children listened, internalized, and passed stories to peers, while adults reflected on the wisdom embedded in legend. Even practical behaviors such as avoiding dangerous paths, respecting authority, or tending crops carefully was intertwined with the moral and fantastical elements of myth. Every tale became a tool for education, social cohesion, and cultural preservation. Ultimately, medieval myths left a lasting legacy. They shaped not only medieval life, but also modern imagination, literature, and folklore. The blend of fear, wonder, courage, and caution taught people how to navigate a complex and often dangerous world. They reminded humanity that the unknown could be understood, respected, and even admired, that imagination and reality are inseparably linked, and that every story carried lessons for survival, ethics, and social harmony. In the end, these myths were more than legends. They were a testament to human creativity, resilience, and the enduring desire to make sense of the world. In the shadowed hours of medieval nights, villagers became landscapes of mystery. Moonlight flickered across cobblestone streets, casting distorted shadows that seemed alive. People spoke of unseen creatures, ghostly figures, strange animals, and spirits wandering in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, distant howl, or sudden clatter became evidence of beings that might lurk just beyond the vision of ordinary eyes. These nighttime tales were a fusion of fear and fascination, capturing imaginations and shaping behavior. Many of these legends had practical roots. Animals like foxes, owls, and stray dogs often created sounds and movements misinterpreted as supernatural activity. Winds through narrow streets, doors shifting on their hinges, or the creaking of old timber added to the suspense. However, imagination amplified these occurrences, turning a small nocturnal sound into the whisper of a lost soul or the approach of a monstrous entity. Stories spread quickly, growing with each telling, until entire nights were envisioned as periods of unseen activity and latent danger. Nighttime legends also served a psychological purpose. They reinforced caution, teaching villagers to travel in groups, avoid dark paths, and remain vigilant. Children learned to respect the unseen, cultivating awareness of their environment. Adults, aware of the practical explanations, still recognized the importance of these stories in instilling discipline, caution, and collective vigilance. Myths about nocturnal entities provided a narrative framework that made sense of both fear and reality, blending survival instincts with imaginative storytelling. Socially, nighttime stories strengthened communal bonds. Fireside gatherings, storytelling circles, and shared whispers about spectral sightings fostered a sense of shared experience. When one family encountered strange sounds, neighbors joined in curiosity or concern. Tales of ghosts, night spirits, or magical animals became cultural touchstones, marking shared knowledge and shared caution. Through these legends, villagers connected the practicalities of safety with the thrill of imagination, blending morality, superstition, and entertainment. Over time, these stories became richly layered. A shadow in the forest might be a fox by day, a demon by night, or a protective spirit in the retelling. Travelers brought tales from other lands, incorporating exotic creatures into local folklore. Festivals, rituals, and protective charms often revolved around these nighttime fears, embedding myths into daily life. For medieval people, darkness was not merely absence of light, it was a canvas for the imagination, a testing ground for courage, and a space where reality and legend intertwined seamlessly. In medieval times, the unknown often manifested as illness. Villages whispered of diseases that struck without warning, sometimes sparing the strong and striking the weak, leading to speculation about curses, divine wrath, or malevolent spirits. Every fever, rash, or sudden collapse was interpreted through lenses of morality and superstition. Families and communities relied on folklore and practical observation alike, blending fear with attempts at control and understanding. Unusual symptoms often inspired tales of the supernatural. A persistent cough might be the result of a rare infection, yet it was said to be a spell from a jealous neighbor or a curse placed on a household. Herbs, charms, and ritual prayers were common remedies, reflecting both the limitations of medical knowledge and the human need for agency. Even when natural causes were responsible, the stories provided a framework to understand and cope with fear, suffering, and death. Medical practitioners, though rare, were integrated into these narratives. Wise women, herbalists, and early physicians employed both remedies and ritual to treat the ill. Their advice often included moral elements, confession, penance, or ethical conduct were thought to enhance recovery. Villagers internalized these beliefs, blending practical treatment with spiritual and imaginative understanding. Disease thus became a lens through which ethics, caution, and communal responsibility were taught. The impact on daily life was significant. Social interactions were guided by caution, with quarantines, protective charms, and observation of symptoms shaping behavior. Festivals and communal events incorporated precautions, often inspired by superstition. Villagers learned to navigate the balance between fear and practicality, imagination and observation. Stories of mysterious illnesses spread, evolving over generations into cautionary tales that combined education, morality, and entertainment. Over time, these tales became embedded in culture, teaching lessons about the fragility of life, respect for unseen forces, and the importance of community vigilance. Illness was never merely a biological event, it was a story of caution, morality, and survival. Children learned respect for health and danger, while adults internalized strategies for protection and care. In medieval Europe, the mysterious disease was a bridge between the real and the imagined, reinforcing cultural knowledge, social cohesion, and moral instruction. In medieval forests, shadows moved as if alive. Villagers told tales of giant wolves, unseen predators, and spirits inhabiting the woods. A lone traveler disappearing in the forest could become a story of a monstrous creature, teeth shining in moonlight, waiting silently for prey. These stories were more than entertainment. They served as warnings, teaching villagers to respect the forest, travel in groups, and remain vigilant. Many legends had roots in real dangers. Wolves, bears, and boars were threats to livestock and humans alike. Rare sightings of large animals or aggressive encounters inspired tales of beasts with supernatural strength or intelligence. Fallen trees, strange tracks, or distant howls could be interpreted as signs of enormous or magical creatures. Stories grew with retelling, turning a dangerous animal into a forest guardian, demon, or giant predator. These tales also conveyed moral lessons. Courage, awareness, and community cooperation were emphasized through stories of villagers confronting the unknown. Those who ignored warnings might face the wrath of the forest, while careful travelers would survive. Children learned to respect nature, avoid danger, and understand the balance between fear and caution. Through storytelling, real events and imagination blended seamlessly, creating legends that guided behavior as much as entertained. The forest itself contributed to the mystery. Fog, dense undergrowth, and shifting light made familiar paths seem alien. Sounds carried unnaturally, and every shadow could conceal danger. Travelers' accounts amplified the legend, while villagers added embellishments of cunning, magic, or monstrous attributes. Night in the medieval forest became a landscape of caution and imagination, where survival depended on observation, courage, and respect for the unknown. Through these stories, villagers internalized lessons about danger, preparedness, and morality. The forest became a teacher, a theater of imagination, and a repository of collective memory. Tales of wild beasts were not mere fantasy. They were practical, cultural, and deeply human reflections on fear, courage, and survival. Caves have always held an aura of mystery, and in medieval Europe, they were seen as entrances to another world. Villagers spoke of deep, dark chambers where shadows moved, whispers echoed, and treasures lay hidden under the watch of unseen guardians. Some caves were believed to house spirits, lost souls, or monstrous beings. Entering one was an act of courage, curiosity, or recklessness, depending on who told the tale. Many legends were inspired by real experiences. Caves could be dangerous, narrow passages, sudden drops, underground rivers, and the presence of bats or other creatures posed real threats. People who got lost or injured were often interpreted as victims of curses or supernatural guardians. Over time, factual dangers merged with imagination, creating stories of ghouls, dwarves, or dragon-like creatures residing within. Exploration of caves often became symbolic. Brave knights, travelers, or treasure hunters were recast as heroes confronting unknown forces. These tales taught caution, problem-solving, and resilience. Villagers learned which caves to avoid and how to navigate known passages safely, embedding practical knowledge within compelling narratives. Fear and curiosity coexisted, making the caves both alluring and forbidding. Environmental phenomena contributed to the mystique. Water dripping in darkness created eerie echoes. Luminous fungi or crystals glowed faintly, and air currents created chilling sensations. Every natural occurrence became potential evidence of magic, guarding spirits, or hidden treasures. Stories of cave adventures blended survival skills with moral lessons, courage with respect for the unknown, and real danger with imaginative embellishment. Ultimately, caves served as both real and symbolic spaces in medieval imagination. They embodied the mysteries of nature, the limits of human understanding, and the potential for heroism or misfortune. Villagers' tales connected everyday life with the unknown, preserving lessons and legends that were as educational as they were thrilling. Medieval societies were fascinated by unusual individuals. People of extraordinary height, remarkable strength, or exceptional skill became the subjects of legend. Villagers shared stories of men and women whose abilities seemed to surpass natural limits. Some could lift massive stones, predict weather, or heal with a touch. These tales reflected both admiration and fear, blending observation with imagination. Many stories originated from real traits. Rare medical conditions, genetic anomalies, or remarkable talent provided the factual basis. A person with gigantism might inspire stories of a giant wandering the land. A prodigy in music or combat could be described as touched by divine favor. Over generations, these traits were woven into elaborate narratives involving magic, divine blessing, or heroic destiny. The social function of these stories was significant. They provided models of behavior, courage, skill, wisdom, and humility. Heroes and unusual individuals served as sources of inspiration, cautionary examples, or entertainment. Villagers internalized lessons about human potential, morality, and the boundaries of possibility. Even fear or jealousy became narrative tools, teaching lessons about envy, pride, and community cohesion. Legends of remarkable people often intersected with other myths. A giant might battle a dragon, a gifted healer could confront a cursed artifact, or an exceptional warrior might protect a haunted castle. These combinations made stories compelling, educational, and memorable. They emphasized that human lives were linked to the extraordinary, that courage, wisdom, and skill could change fate, and that imagination could transform reality into legend. In essence, medieval tales of unusual individuals bridged the gap between observation and creativity. They celebrated human diversity, highlighted moral lessons, and nurtured communal memory. Every extraordinary person became a story, every deed a lesson, and every life a thread in the tapestry of legend, ensuring that courage, skill, and imagination were remembered across generations. Medieval people often turned to mysterious remedies to cure illnesses that medicine alone could not explain. Herbal concoctions, strange poultices, and ritualistic preparations were believed to possess magical powers. A root might heal fevers, a potion could ward off evil spirits, or a chant could restore strength. These practices were not purely superstition. They often included genuine medicinal herbs, combined with ritual and imagination to enhance effectiveness. Herbalists, wise women, and early physicians played crucial roles. They combined observation with folklore, crafting remedies that blended practicality with belief. The rituals surrounding these treatments, incantations, charms, and ceremonial preparation reinforced communal values and moral behavior. Villagers believed that intention and faith were as important as the ingredients themselves. Socially, these remedies strengthened community bonds. People gathered to witness the preparation, shared knowledge of local herbs, and participated in rituals that promoted cohesion. Children learned respect for nature, the importance of careful observation, and the blending of faith and action. Illness became not only a challenge of the body but also a moral and communal lesson. Even when remedies failed, the process provided comfort, guidance, and reassurance. These stories and practices endured an oral tradition, linking observation, imagination, and social norms. In medieval Europe, the line between practical treatment and magical belief was fluid, creating a rich tapestry of healing, morality, and narrative that influenced generations. Rivers and lakes in medieval Europe were often seen as living entities, full of mystery and hidden dangers. Villagers told stories of spirits inhabiting the waters, monstrous fish, or treasures hidden in the depths. Drowning, sudden floods, or strange phenomena were explained through these tales, blending fear with imagination. Many legends had practical origins. Floods, dangerous currents, and unseen hazards made rivers risky. Rare sightings of large fish, beavers, or otters could be interpreted as supernatural creatures. Nighttime reflections, unusual waves, and unexpected fog enhanced the eerie atmosphere. Stories amplified these events, creating cautionary tales that warned villagers to respect water and practice vigilance. The myths served multiple purposes. They educated children on the dangers of water, promoted respect for the natural environment, and provided shared entertainment. Fishermen and travelers passed down practical advice through imaginative storytelling, ensuring lessons were memorable. Even the fear of spirits or magical guardians instilled a sense of respect and caution that contributed to safety and social cohesion. Ultimately, rivers and lakes became both sources of life and wonder, places where danger and imagination coexisted. Tales of water spirits, hidden treasures, and mysterious creatures enriched medieval folklore while embedding real knowledge of natural hazards, making these stories both thrilling and instructive. Seafarers and coastal villagers in medieval Europe shared tales of strange creatures lurking beneath waves. Giant fish, serpentine shapes, and mysterious lights at night were often described as water spirits, sea monsters, or cursed sailors. These stories conveyed both fear and fascination, teaching respect for the unpredictability of the sea. Many legends had factual bases: tidal surges, storms, and encounters with whales, dolphins, or unusual fish created the impression of enormous sea creatures. Shipwrecks and drownings further fueled tales of supernatural guardians or malevolent beings. Mariners passed stories along with practical advice, which currents to avoid, when to sail, and how to recognize approaching storms. The stories served moral and social functions. Courage, preparedness, and vigilance were celebrated, while neglect or recklessness led to disaster. Children and villagers learned both maritime knowledge and moral lessons through narrative. The blending of real observation and imaginative storytelling reinforced culture, survival, and ethics. Ultimately, the sea became a theater of wonder and caution, its myths carrying both entertainment and wisdom. Tales of sea monsters, drowned treasures, and spectral sailors kept communities safe, connected, and imaginative. Medieval maritime folklore was a perfect example of blending reality and the supernatural into enduring lessons and stories. Temples in medieval villages were centers of both worship and wonder. Villagers spoke of sacred halls where statues seemed to move, candles flickered without wind, and prayers evoked mysterious phenomena. Tales often described monks or priests encountering visions, hearing divine voices, or seeing lights where no source existed. Many phenomena had practical explanations: drafty corridors, reflective surfaces, and the play of sunlight could create illusions. Yet, imagination amplified these experiences, turning ordinary events into miracles or supernatural encounters. Stories taught reverence, morality, and caution. Children learned to respect sacred spaces and elders, while adults internalized moral lessons through narrative. Temples also served social cohesion. Rituals, festivals, and storytelling around sacred sites reinforced community identity. Narratives connected everyday behavior with divine expectation, emphasizing ethical conduct, gratitude, and vigilance. Myths of mysterious events at temples ensured respect and continuity of cultural norms. Ultimately, medieval temples combined spirituality, morality, and imagination. Legends of moving statues, unexplained lights, or miraculous events became vehicles for teaching values, preserving history, and blending the mystical with the real. Royal courts in medieval times were centers of intrigue, power, and legend. Tales circulated of kings encountering ghostly advisors, mysterious courtiers, or secret passages within grand palaces. These narratives often dramatized political maneuvering, betrayal, or heroic feats, blending reality with supernatural embellishment. Behind the legends lay real events, rivalries, plots, secret meetings, and dramatic decisions. A cautious king, a loyal knight, or a treacherous courtier became the subject of stories that transformed political intrigue into lessons of virtue, loyalty, and strategy. The supernatural elements, whispering shadows, enchanted artifacts, or cursed chambers and and storytelling, and moral emphasis. For villagers and courtiers alike, these tales reinforced respect for authority and vigilance. Stories warned against disloyalty, promoted courage, and illustrated the consequences of ambition. They educated while entertaining, ensuring that lessons from history, morality, and survival persisted through generations. Ultimately, royal myths blended politics, power, and imagination, creating narratives that preserved history, entertained communities, and guided behavior. Medieval courts were not only centers of governance, but stages for legend, mystery, and moral teaching. Hidden schools and libraries in medieval Europe inspired stories of secret knowledge, forbidden texts, and mysterious masters. Villagers whispered about scholars who could summon knowledge from ancient books, create invisible ink, or interpret celestial signs. Legends often suggested that the pursuit of knowledge was entwined with magic, power, and secrecy. Many stories had practical origins. Monks, scholars, and scribes did guard important manuscripts and engaged in careful study. Rare books, coded manuscripts, and private teachings created a sense of mystery. Over time, imagination transformed these precautions into tales of secret wisdom, mystical rites, or enchanted learning. The legends served social and educational purposes. They emphasized the value of learning, curiosity, discipline, and respect for knowledge. Children and apprentices learned about ethics, intellectual rigor, and the boundaries of human understanding. These tales encouraged study, critical thinking, and moral conduct while captivating imagination. Ultimately, hidden schools became symbols of human curiosity, resilience, and imagination. Knowledge, once concealed, inspired stories of adventure, morality, and discovery, blending real learning with myth and providing lessons that endured for generations. Medieval inventions and mechanical devices often seemed magical to ordinary villagers. Clocks, watermills, catapults, or intricate siege machines were subjects of awe. Stories circulated that certain contraptions were powered by spirits, enchanted gears, or divine intervention. Observers could hardly distinguish between practical engineering and supernatural wonder. Many tales originated from actual innovation. Engineers and artisans created advanced machines that surpassed common understanding. The complexity inspired stories of magic and otherworldly skill. Legends amplified achievements, transforming engineers into wizards or inventors capable of feats beyond human comprehension. These stories encouraged curiosity, respect for ingenuity, and the desire to learn. They preserved knowledge, celebrated skill, and taught the importance of observation and experimentation. Villagers learned to admire innovation while blending it with imagination, making invention both practical and legendary. Ultimately, medieval technology became part of the cultural narrative. Machines were not merely tools, they were symbols of human potential, imagination, and ingenuity, bridging reality with wonder in the stories told around firesides and marketplaces. Medieval people interpreted natural disasters as messages from the divine or manifestations of supernatural anger. Earthquakes, lightning, floods, and storms were often attributed to wrathful gods, cursed lands, or mystical forces. Communities relied on ritual, prayer, and communal observation to survive these events. Practical experience explained some disasters, flood patterns, seasonal storms, or seismic activity, but storytelling added moral and supernatural dimensions. Villagers learned lessons of humility, preparation, and community solidarity. Tales of punishment or miraculous survival were retold to reinforce ethical behavior, encourage vigilance, and provide comfort amidst chaos. Socially, disasters strengthened bonds. Communities collaborated to rebuild, shared resources, and created rituals to prevent future misfortune. Stories combined observation, morality, and imagination, ensuring that both knowledge and cultural identity endured. Ultimately, natural phenomena in medieval lore were both reality and metaphor, blending survival, morality, and imagination into enduring cultural narratives. Stories of spirits and restless souls were common in medieval Europe. Villagers spoke of apparitions wandering fields, shadowy figures in homes, or cries echoing at night. Such stories reflected human fear of death, uncertainty, and the unknown. Many of these legends arose from real events. Shadows, sounds, or illness could be interpreted as ghostly presence. Psychological factors, grief, anxiety, and imagination amplified experiences. Sleepwalking night terrors or unfamiliar noises were woven into narrative, creating compelling tales of spirits and warnings. These stories had social and moral value, respect for the dead, proper burial practices, and ethical behavior were reinforced. Children learned lessons about fear, courage, and empathy, while adults internalized communal standards. Legends bridged the living and the departed, mixing human emotion with imaginative storytelling. Ultimately, ghosts, in medieval lore, were mirrors of human emotion. They taught caution, respect, and morality, while entertaining and reinforcing cultural norms. Fear became both education and art, making tales of spirits enduring and instructive. Medieval battles were legendary not only for strategy but for tales of superhuman courage. Knights and soldiers were described as wielding enchanted weapons or receiving divine strength. A brave act could become a story of victory over monsters or supernatural forces. Real feats inspired myth. Exceptional skill, endurance, or leadership were magnified through storytelling. Heroes became symbols of courage and morality, teaching lessons about loyalty, bravery, and honor. Villagers absorbed these stories, learning about strategy, vigilance, and ethics through narrative. The combination of reality and imagination made war stories compelling. Legends inspired courage, caution, and resilience. They connected human experience with moral and cultural lessons, turning historical events into enduring narratives that educated and entertained simultaneously. Stories of princesses often blended beauty, virtue, and mysterious powers. Villages told of royal daughters who could heal, foresee danger, or charm creatures. These tales reflected societal ideals, aspiration, and the blending of human experience with imagination. Some stories were inspired by diplomacy, intelligence, or leadership. Royal influence and political maneuvers were recast as magical ability. Legends conveyed moral and social lessons, emphasizing wisdom, courage, and ethical behavior. Princess tales engaged imagination while embedding cultural norms. They taught children virtue and adults vigilance. In medieval Europe, royalty became mythic, merging reality with wonder, ensuring stories endured through generations. Legends of giants and demons were popular in medieval folklore. Villagers told stories of enormous beings, threatening towns, guarding treasures, or testing human courage. Real dangers, wild animals, bandits, or natural hazards were amplified into mythic encounters. These tales taught vigilance, bravery, and moral behavior. A young man confronting a giant symbolized the triumph of courage and cleverness. Communities reinforced lessons through retelling, connecting imagination with practical advice about survival. Demons and giants became metaphors for fear, adversity, and challenge. Through storytelling, villages internalized lessons about ethics, courage, and human potential. Pilgrimages to holy sites were rich with legend. Travelers reported visions, miraculous healings, or divine guidance. Real experiences, physical challenge, environmental hazards, and extraordinary sights were interpreted as signs of the divine. Stories reinforced piety, perseverance, and respect. Villagers learned about moral conduct, the value of faith, and communal identity. Legends of pilgrimages combined awe, instruction, and imagination, making journeys spiritually and culturally significant. Ancient scripts and inscriptions fascinated medieval people. Unknown symbols inspired tales of hidden knowledge, curses, or treasure maps. Scholars, monks, and travelers speculated on meanings, combining observation with imagination. Legends encouraged study, caution, and respect for the past. Children and adults learned about human history, curiosity, and cultural heritage. The stories preserved knowledge while weaving moral and imaginative layers, connecting communities to their past. Medieval myths left enduring legacies, from haunted castles to heroic knights, supernatural beasts, mysterious caves, and enchanted relics. Each story blended reality, imagination, and moral teaching. Communities used these tales to educate children, guide behavior, and transmit culture. Legends reinforced courage, vigilance, morality, and social cohesion. Fear was transformed into wisdom. Imagination became a bridge to knowledge, and stories preserved cultural memory. The myths shaped identity, entertained, and offered practical lessons disguised as fantasy. In the end, medieval myths were more than entertainment. They reflected human curiosity, fear, creativity, and morality. They reminded us that imagination and reality coexist, that stories teach, guide, and inspire, and that even centuries later, these legends continue to captivate hearts and minds, bridging past and present.